The train came to a slow, groaning stop in the thick Louisiana night. Greta sat motionless, her fingers digging into the wooden bench beneath her, trying to calm the silent panic building in her chest. The other women around her, Liesel, Anna, a few others whose names she hadn't yet learned, stared out through the grime-smeared windows with a mix of dread and exhaustion. They had crossed an ocean and a continent in locked compartments, expecting to be met by barbed wire, dogs, and shouting men. Everything in them braced for hostility. When the car doors finally slid open, the first thing they noticed was the light. Blinding, searing light flooded into the compartment, turning the dark into artificial day. It was unlike anything they had seen during the war, pure, unyielding, and bright enough to make them raise their arms instinctively. Greta blinked, disoriented, expecting this to be part of the intimidation. Instead, what she saw made her breath catch. A wide, spotless platform. Soldiers standing calmly. And in the center, a woman in a crisp uniform waiting for them, not with a weapon, but with a clipboard. They stepped out, one by one, each movement stiff from travel and fear. Greta's boots touched American soil with reluctant finality. She felt like she had crossed into another dimension, not just another country. Around her, the air smelled faintly of pine and something else, something almost sweet. The woman introduced herself in practiced German as Captain Reynolds. Her voice was neither cold nor theatrical. It was civil. What followed didn't match any of their expectations. They were handed metal cups filled with hot coffee, real coffee, not the burnt chicory substitute they had grown used to. The taste hit Greta like a memory she had forgotten she owned. She looked down at the cup, unsure if she should drink it. Was this a trick? A test? But the warmth seeped through her hands, and she brought it to her lips without thinking. The bitterness grounded her. It was real. Around her, other women were having the same reaction. Liesel looked suspicious, but didn't reject the drink. Anna nearly cried when she took her first sip. The American soldiers kept their distance, gave instructions in respectful tones, and gestured toward the buildings ahead. "Those are your quarters," the captain said. "Not cells, not holding units, quarters." They followed in silence, not quite trusting what they were seeing. The barracks were simple, but shockingly clean. Wooden floors, electric heaters, glass windows that reflected the strange electric glow of the compound. Greta walked slower than the rest, taking in every detail. This was not the prison camp she had imagined. This was something else entirely. Inside, the rows of beds were made with fresh white sheets, folded with care. Footlockers stood at the base of each one. Greta saw her name typed neatly on a card above a bed. Electric lights hummed overhead, steady and quiet. The room was warm, far from the cold cement and iron she'd been bracing for. She stood in place, overwhelmed. If this was captivity, it didn't make sense. Captain Reynolds handete outprintete Pakete in Deutsch, outleinen den Camps Prozeduren, Mealtimes, medizinische Untersuchungen, Rekreationshours. Alles war strukturiert, organisiert, predictable. Da war eben Menschen von Library Access und Medical Aid. Greka fehlte sanft Zwicken in seiner Unsicherheit, maybe Grief. Sie hatte bin so schur von was erwartete denen, so schur, dass Amerikaner würden haten den, punishen den, dass denen sie feinlich die Brutalität erleben würden, die sie in ihren eigenen Camps erlebt hatten. But here, in this place bathed in light and quiet order, Greta found herself doubting everything, not just about America, but about the world she thought she understood. The days that followed unfolded with unnerving order. Greta expected the facade of civility to crumble quickly, revealing the cold hand of captivity beneath. But each morning brought warmth, structure, and routine that felt more like a hospital than a prison. Wake-up calls came with gentle knocks, not whistles or screams. Breakfast was hot and timed precisely, served with enough food to make her question whether rationing was truly a wartime necessity here. Assigned to the camp's medical wing due to her background, Greta stepped cautiously into a space that stopped her mid-step. The walls were tiled, the floors scrubbed to a shine, and the equipment, real, functioning, advanced, stood neatly organized on metal carts. She saw cabinets lined with antibiotics, morphine vials, sterilized instruments, and something she had only seen once before, in a ruined hospital in Berlin, a working X-ray machine. Her hands, which once trembled from improvising surgeries with dull scalpels and reused gauze, now hovered above abundance. Dr. Mitchell, the American physician in charge, greeted her not as a subordinate, but as a colleague. "We can use the help," he said without hesitation, handing her a stethoscope. It was not a test or a symbolic gesture. He genuinely wanted her opinion on a patient's respiratory issue. Greta hesitated, expecting a catch, but found none. They worked side by side, the rhythm of medical professionalism overriding the lines of nationality and war. The other American staff treated her with quiet respect. Nurses explained procedures, asked for her input, and didn't speak down to her. She noticed that no one here operated from fear. No barking orders, no looking over shoulders, no paranoia about sabotage. In this clinic, medicine came first. The irony was not lost on her. She had to be captured by the enemy to feel like a real doctor again. One afternoon, while organizing the pharmacy inventory, she remarked on the sheer volume of morphine available. "We order more than we need," Dr. Mitchell replied casually. "Better to have too much than run out." That phrase echoed in her mind for hours. In Germany, every dose had been a desperate calculation. Here, excess was a precaution, not a luxury. It was more than a difference in logistics. It was a different philosophy. Even more disorienting was the way wounded German prisoners were treated. One young man with a festering leg wound was brought in, and Greta winced, expecting delay or minimal attention. But the staff reacted immediately. He was stabilized, cleaned, medicated, and monitored, no different than any Allied soldier might have been. Not a single nurse questioned if the supplies were wasted on an enemy. That moment shook her more than any speech could have. Outside the clinic, Captain Reynolds continued her quiet campaign of compassion. She ensured the women received proper winter clothing, real wool coats that held warmth even in the damp chill of southern nights. When an elderly woman mentioned arthritic pain, she began receiving warm compresses and aspirin, automatically, no pleading required. Small gestures, perhaps, but Greta noticed how they accumulated. They weren't strategic acts, they were habits. Even Lysol, once the loudest voice of distrust, grew quieter. She still muttered about manipulation, about psychological warfare, but the fire had dimmed. She drank the coffee, wore the coat, accepted the medical care. Greta saw it, resistance fading, not from coercion, but from the exhaustion of contradiction. Their captors were behaving more humanely than their own officers ever had. The final blow to her certainty came from a simple conversation. An American nurse named Patricia was taking inventory with Greta, chatting idly about plans for the evening. She mentioned her apartment in town, her roommate, a movie they were planning to see. Greta asked if she was stationed here permanently, and Patricia laughed. "No, I applied for this job. I can leave when I want. I just have to give notice." Freedom of employment, housing, movement, spoken about like weather. Greta stood there, clipboard in hand, trying to process it. This woman had choices. She lived outside the barbed wire. She wasn't assigned, controlled, measured. She was free. And yet here she was, treating Greta as a peer, without resentment, without judgment. That night, Greta didn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the unblinking electric bulb above her bed, the steady warmth of the heater humming at her feet. The machine of light around her wasn't just physical. It was a system, a structure, a way of life that functioned on a level of freedom and abundance that Germany had called fiction. But it was real. It was all real. It was a cold morning in January when the mail arrived. The women had waited weeks for any word from home, but most letters never made it. When Sergeant Kowalski began calling names, the air in the common area seemed to tighten. Greta's heart raced as she heard her name, followed by Lizel's. Clutching the envelope, she returned to her cot, hands trembling with anticipation and dread. Greta unfolded the letter from her sister in Hamburg with care, the paper fragile from its long journey. The words written in careful script described a city collapsing. Electricity had been out for weeks. They burned furniture to keep warm. Hospitals were closed, doctors gone, children crying from hunger. Her sister wrote that a neighbor had died from a simple infection that any antibiotic could have cured, if there had been any medicine left. The contrast was grotesque. Greta read those words under steady electric light, with the scent of baking bread drifting in from the camp kitchen. She glanced around at the other women opening their letters in silence. Some wore expressions of growing horror. Others simply stopped reading, unable to continue. It wasn't just the suffering that shocked them. It was the realization of how different their lives had become since arriving here. Across the room, Liesl sat completely still, her eyes locked on a single page. Her lips moved silently as she reread a paragraph again and again. When Greta approached, Liesl handed her the letter without speaking. It was from Margot, a friend in Berlin. She described a bombing raid that had destroyed much of their neighborhood. But what stunned Liesl most was the revelation that Americans had dropped warning leaflets 3 days before the attack. Margot wrote that the leaflets included maps advising residents to evacuate specific blocks. Most people had left in time. After the bombing, American planes returned, not with bombs, but with bandages, morphine, and food. American medics worked alongside German doctors to treat anyone injured. Greta read the lines twice, then a third time. She couldn't comprehend it. What kind of enemy warned civilians and then helped them survive? The question echoed in her mind throughout the day. She remembered the propaganda films, the speeches, the images of Americans as violent, chaotic, inferior. And yet here she was, living under their protection, receiving their medical care, eating their food, and now reading about them saving the very people they were fighting. It was impossible, but it happened. That evening, Captain Reynolds made an announcement that shook them even further. From now on, the women would have access to radio broadcasts from multiple sources: American, German, British, and neutral. Truth, she said, is not something to be rationed. You deserve to know what's happening in your homeland. Greta felt both grateful and terrified. If what they had heard so far was only the beginning, what else was waiting to be uncovered? They listened first to German radio. The broadcast was familiar, promises of secret weapons, defiant rhetoric. But now it sounded desperate, disconnected from the reality described in their letters. Then came the BBC. The British voice detailed the collapse of German infrastructure, the retreat of forces, the starvation of cities. It matched what Greta had read in her sister's handwriting. There was no denying it anymore. But the American broadcast was what truly shattered something inside Liesl. The reporter told stories of bomber crews requesting permission to drop medical supplies over civilian zones, of pilots volunteering for mercy missions into enemy territory, of field hospitals where wounded German soldiers were treated next to Allied troops. The voice was calm, matter-of-fact, even respectful. It wasn't gloating, it was simply humane. After the broadcast ended, Liesl stared at the radio like it had betrayed her. "My father always said Americans were soft," she said softly. "He said they'd never win a real war because they lacked the stomach for it." Her voice wavered. "But what if kindness is strength?" Greta didn't answer. She didn't need to. They both knew something inside them had changed. That night, Greta lay in her cot, the letter from Hamburg folded tightly in her hand. Her sister had ended with a line that wouldn't leave her mind. "I dream of electric lights and hot food. I dream of doctors who have enough medicine to help everyone. Do such places really exist, or are they just stories?" Greta stared up at the light above her bed. She was living in that story, and it was real. The letter that arrived in February was thin, no more than a single sheet, but its contents struck harder than anything Liesl had faced since the beginning of the war. She accepted it quietly from Sergeant Kowalski, her face a mask of composure. Greta watched her fingers tremble slightly as she opened it, unfolding the page with slow, deliberate care. Liesl read it once, then again, her eyes scanning the lines as if hoping the words might change. But the truth remained fixed in ink. Her father, Colonel Heinrich Weber, had been executed as a traitor to the Reich. Not for dissent, not for resistance, but for failing to punish dissenters quickly enough after the failed July 20th assassination attempt on Hitler. He had not protected the conspirators, but he had hesitated, and in the new climate of paranoia, hesitation was enough. He died facing the same firing squad he had once helped command. The regime he served had devoured him. Liesl didn't speak. She stood up, walked back to her cot, and lay down with the letter clutched in her hand. For 3 days, she neither ate nor responded to anyone. Greta sat beside her, occasionally touching her arm, murmuring small words of comfort that never seemed to land. Liesl stared at the ceiling, her face blank, her eyes red but dry. She had not just lost her father, she had lost the Virgil of him she had carried inside her for her entire life. Captain Reynolds came to the barracks one evening, carrying a thick manila folder. She didn't ask for permission. She simply sat at the edge of Liesl's cot and began laying out photographs and documents. Greta watched in silence as Liesl turned her head slightly, curiosity flickering for the first time in days. Captain Reynolds said quietly, "These are from the camps we've liberated. Your father's name is on some of the transfer orders." The photos were brutal. Emaciated figures in striped uniforms, piles of shoes and glasses, rooms lined with hooks and drains. Among the documents were official German memos, transport authorizations, supply requests, efficiency reports. Many bore the unmistakable signature of Colonel Heinrich Weber. His handwriting, the same elegant script he had used to sign Liesl's school permissions, was now tied to atrocities. Words like increase capacity and optimize disposal made Liesl recoil. She reached out suddenly, grabbing one of the pages, staring at the signature as if trying to convince herself it was forged. Her lips moved silently, mouthing words from memory, perhaps trying to reconcile the father who had read her bedtime stories with the officer who had approved death trains. "He didn't know," she finally whispered, but her voice lacked certainty. The evidence was overwhelming. Captain Reynolds placed one final document in her lap. It was a detailed camp report with notes in her father's hand, outlining execution procedures. At the bottom was a sentence that chilled the room. Approved for implementation. Increase efficiency as discussed. That sentence shattered the last wall Liesl had been holding up. She folded over, sobbing into her hands with a rawness that silenced the entire barracks. There was no rage, only grief. For hours, Liesel wept while Greta held her. It wasn't just about her father. It was about everything. The rallies she had attended, the slogans she had repeated, the neighbors she had watched disappear without asking why. It all came crashing down in one relentless wave. She whispered over and over, "I helped them." Greta didn't correct her. In some way, they all had. The other women sat nearby, quiet, shaken. Some looked away, others silently cried with her. They had all lost something that night: innocence, illusion, denial. The truth had found them, and it didn't care whether they had pulled the trigger or simply looked away. The weight of collective guilt settled like dust in the corners of the room, impossible to ignore. For the next few days, Liesel remained in her bunk, refusing food and medication. Even when Dr. Mitchell offered mild sedatives to help her sleep, she refused. Her silence was not stubbornness. It was mourning. She was grieving not only her father's death, but the betrayal of everything he had stood for. The realization that the man she had loved was also a willing architect of horror left her hollow. No one tried to rush her healing. Captain Reynolds didn't force conversation, and Greta stayed near, offering presence instead of answers. They all understood that there are truths so heavy they don't just break the heart, they reshape it. And Liesel's world, once filled with certainty, had been ground into ash. It happened just after midnight on a damp March night. Anna Richter, one of the quieter women in the camp, went into labor far earlier than expected. Her screams pierced the silence of the barracks, sending a jolt through everyone. The American medics arrived quickly, wheeling her to the medical wing while shouting instructions. Greta, already awake from a restless night, followed without hesitation. She didn't ask for permission. Instinct took over. The medical wing burst into organized chaos. Dr. Mitchell took charge while American nurses prepped the room. Greta stood beside Anna, holding her hand, translating where necessary and offering quiet reassurances. The labor was complicated, the baby in breech position, and the fear in Anna's eyes was as sharp as any battlefield wound. But no one hesitated. No one judged her for being German. In that room, nationalities meant nothing. Then, in the doorway, a shadow appeared. Liesel. She stood still for a moment, pale and hollow-eyed, as if not quite sure what had drawn her there. Slowly, she stepped forward, her movements stiff from days of lying in silence. She didn't speak. She simply reached out and took Anna's other hand, gripping it tightly. Something in that gesture spoke louder than any words. The baby arrived after 2 exhausting hours, a small, red-faced girl with a powerful cry. As the nurses cleaned and swaddled the newborn, Liesel reached out and took the child into her arms. She looked down at the infant, blinking back tears, her expression trembling between devastation and wonder. "She doesn't know," Liesel whispered, almost to herself. "She doesn't know anything about the war, about the camps, about what we did." The room went still for a moment. The baby, wrapped in soft cloth, let out a soft coo and nestled into Liesel's chest. Greta watched the transformation in her friend's face. The deep hollowness remained, but a new presence began to take shape beneath it. In the fragile warmth of that newborn life, something in Liesel reconnected with the world. Her breath grew steady, her hands stopped shaking. Captain Reynolds stepped forward and rested a gentle hand on Liesel's shoulder. Her voice was calm and low. "That's where we start, with the ones who haven't learned to hate yet, with the ones we can protect from the lies." Liesel looked up, eyes full of questions she couldn't yet speak, but she nodded, a single, small nod that carried the weight of everything she had endured. In the days that followed, Liesel began to return to herself. Slowly, like a person emerging from the ruins of a collapsed house. She walked during the exercise hours, read from the library, and even helped in the medical wing. Her steps were still hesitant, but they moved forward. Anna named her daughter Giselle and asked Liesel to be her godmother. It was the first time Liesel had smiled in weeks. The camp, too, seemed to shift. The atmosphere grew softer, more human. Women began talking more openly, not just about the past, but about the future. Conversations turned toward rebuilding, toward choices that lay ahead. Greta noticed it during meals, during morning roll calls. Eyes that had once darted away from contact now held longer gazes. Walls were not gone, but they were cracking. One evening, under a clear Louisiana sky, Greta and Liesel sat together outside the barracks. The stars above them shimmered with an impossible calm. In the distance, the electric lights of the nearby town flickered like a second sky. Liesel spoke without being prompted. "I don't know how we come back from what we've seen, from what we've done." Greta didn't answer right away. Instead, she placed a hand over Liesel's and let the silence speak first. "Finally," she said, "maybe we don't go back. Maybe we go forward, but not with the same beliefs, not with the same blindness." Liesel nodded slowly, eyes still fixed on the lights in the distance. In that moment, both of them understood that recovery was not about forgetting. It was about choosing what to carry into the future and what to leave behind. And in the arms of a child born between two broken nations, they had found the faint outline of something worth building. In early May, the war officially ended. Captain Reynolds gathered all the prisoners in the common area to make the announcement. Her voice was steady, without triumph or cruelty, as she told them that Germany had surrendered. There was no cheering, no clapping, just a silence that fell heavy, like a dense fog settling over the room. For many of the women, it was not just the end of a war, it was the death of a belief system. Greta felt tears in her eyes, but she couldn't name what they were for. Relief, maybe? Or mourning for the version of herself who had believed in something noble. She realized now that the Germany she had served had been built on sand and blood. And yet, hearing that it was gone felt like losing a limb. Her homeland had not been liberated, it had collapsed. Over the next few days, conversations shifted toward repatriation. Some women wanted to go home, to find family, to bury what was lost. Others whispered of staying, of starting anew in a country that had shown them compassion they hadn't even known to expect. Greta wasn't sure where she belonged. All she knew was that the person who had arrived at Camp Ruston was not the person who would leave it. One afternoon, Captain Reynolds invited Greta to the medical wing. She brought a leather satchel and laid it gently on the examination table. Inside was a stack of American medical journals, meticulously organized. "These are for you," she said simply. "Techniques, procedures, notes from the field. Everything we've developed during the war. Not as propaganda, but as tools to rebuild." Greta opened one and immediately recognized the value. This was more than information. It was a map out of the ruins. When she asked why, Captain Reynolds paused. Then she said, "Because I believe you'll use it, because you've seen what's possible now, and because you'll go where these pages can make a difference." Greta felt a lump in her throat. It wasn't just a gesture of trust. It was an invitation to become something more than a survivor. Liesel had made her choice. She would stay in America and begin nurse training under a refugee assistance program. Anna had decided to return to Bavaria with little Giselle and reopen her family's old medical practice. Greta would return to Hamburg, with the journals, with a recommendation letter from Captain Reynolds, and with a vision that had once been unthinkable, not to serve the Reich, but to heal what it had broken. The night before departure, Captain Reynolds held a small gathering. She gave each woman a folded American flag, not as a symbol of victory, but of the possibilities that had emerged from mercy. "This isn't about becoming American," she said. "It's about remembering what we've learned. That kindness is not weakness. That light can be stronger than any weapon." The flags were small enough to fit in a suitcase, but heavy with meaning. As the repatriation ship pulled away from New Orleans harbor, Greta stood on the deck watching the city lights stretch out across the horizon. They reminded her of that first night stepping off the train, blinded and overwhelmed by the brilliance. Back then, the lights had seemed impossible, unreal. Now they were a promise, a reminder that there was another way to live, a different kind of power. In her suitcase, Greta carried surgical diagrams and hospital blueprints. In her pocket, she carried the letter that would open doors back home. But in her heart, she carried something far more precious, the knowledge that enemies could choose to heal instead of harm, that mercy could be stronger than vengeance, that even after all they had seen, something beautiful could still grow. The ship rolled gently over the dark Atlantic, but Greta no longer feared what waited on the other side. She whispered into the wind, repeating words she once could not imagine believing. "Now I know what's possible." And in the quiet that followed, she felt something settle in her chest. Not grief, not fear, but purpose. A direction illuminated not by orders, but by choice.